Amak nerat ike tesol derat ik merut.
Hey all, Dave here. A while back I mentioned that I would probably start doing more questions for atheist response style videos. There's been nothing really unique that I've come across as far as questions for atheist videos and blog posts are concerned. Everything I've seen has been the same old kinds of questions, with standard fare as far as the questions are concerned. There have been a few videos I've seen that I thought might make for an interesting just standard response video though, so I figured I would try my hand at a few of them instead. Starting with this one from the channel Lloyd de Jong. Most of Lloyd's back catalogue of videos seems to focus on critiquing Islam, which isn't really of much interest to me, and I would imagine you too. This video focuses on atheism though, so this one is of interest to me, and hopefully you too. The video is titled Atheists Can't Define Atheism, Contradictory Definitions. You can probably tell from the title that it focuses on the definition of atheism, something I've been known to focus on myself. Some of what is said in the video will allow me to expand on some of my own views about the definition of atheism and the arguments for the definition of atheism. There are also some faulty arguments and criticisms in the video that I think are worth looking at. So with no further ado, let's jump into Lloyd's video. I'll play the relevant bits of the video and then respond to what's said. The original video only being about 5 minutes long means that it should take me no longer than about 8 or 9 hours, judging from past experiences of the live streams that Joe and I have done on the Air channel anyway. Of course, I'm jesting. I'll try to keep the video as short as possible.
This is a really short video. I want to do one slide on the contradictions in atheist thinking, the contradictions between atheist thinkers, philosophers, scientists. I have to ask, is contradiction scientific?
So, asking this question here in this context seems a little odd to me. Lloyd does use a lot of snark in his video, so this could be snark. It could be referencing the need that many atheists have to link everything to science and link their language to scientific language, like we see the linking of the null hypothesis to atheism. The tone doesn't really sound like it's a snarky question though. However, it's worthy of a response here as the question is misplaced in both its snarky form and its genuine form. Let's look at it in its genuine form first. In its genuine form, the question is misplaced because the definition of words doesn't fall under the purview of science. It falls under the purview of linguistics, meaning that even if science did not allow for contradictions, it would make no difference in this case. Arguing that science doesn't allow for contradictions does nothing to argue for the idea that words are not allowed to have contradictory meanings. Words get their meanings from how they're used, which includes the tone that they are used in. Telling someone that they did something brilliant or are a genius can mean completely different opposite things depending on the tone that it's said in. Of course, one could argue here and say that sarcasm makes these things special cases, but there are words that have opposite or contradictory meanings in everyday non-sarcastic usages too. These kind of words are referred to as a contronym. So even if science didn't allow for contradiction, linguistics certainly seems to. And the question doesn't quite work as snark either. While I agree that there are many atheists and skeptics that often try to use scientific language related to their atheism and skepticism, and that it's often misplaced, they do not apply science to their language. I have had many arguments with many atheists about the definition of atheism, and none have ever tried to use science to argue for the definition, or try to use the scientific method to prove what the one true definition of atheism is. They have all used arguments based in linguistics to argue for it, so the snark is very misplaced here.
We're discussing here a very famous philosopher called Nagel. He was part of a series of writers who wrote this book, The Critiques of God, making the case against the belief in God. This is not just a lack of belief. This is an active series of arguments to demonstrate the superiority of atheism, why Christianity is false, why atheism is true.
Here we see him describe the book as a collection of arguments making the case that God does not exist and that Christianity is false, which is common fare when it comes to arguments from philosophers and even some scientists. I often come across atheists who claim that atheism has no arguments, as well as making the claim that atheism is not the claim that God does not exist. This book is a good example for why both of those statements are false. There is a large collection of literature and arguments for atheism in the sense that God does not exist. It is also the most common version of atheism when it comes to philosophy. And I wish I could get more of the popular atheist talking heads to acknowledge and promote this idea. They really do a disservice to atheism and atheists by promoting the idea that atheists do not argue that God does not exist, and that atheism is not the claim that God does not exist, and the idea that there are no arguments for atheism.
So I guess these are not real atheists because they don't just have a lack of belief.
Remember what I said about there being plenty of snark in the video? But unlike the previous snark I mentioned, I don't think this one is misplaced. I have come across many atheists that argue that those defining atheism as a belief do not understand what atheism is or need to learn what atheism is. I have also come across atheists that argue that people like Graham Oppy is an idiot who doesn't understand what atheism actually is. There have been many that have told me that I understand nothing about atheism, even though I have been an atheist my entire life. Sometimes for even longer than those telling me I need to learn about atheism have been alive. There has even been a shift in terminology recently where people have started defining those that believe God does not exist as anti-theists, and saying they are not atheists. So the snark here is not unwarranted. There are those that would claim that those philosophers and psychologists writing in the book being spoken of know nothing about atheism, and there are those that would argue that they're not actually atheists.
Let's have a look. I must begin by stating what sense I'm attaching to the word atheism. A critique and a denial of the major claims of all varieties of theism. Again, not a lack of belief, a denial, a verb.
Defining what we mean by the term that we're using is just good philosophical practice. That way the reader of the essay understands what is being spoken about in the essay itself. Even when the term is being used in the most common way, it will often be defined early on, especially if the essay and argument hinges on how that term is being used. One thing to note here is that there is nothing about how it is used in the essay or work that means that the term must be used that way outside of the scope of the essay. There is nothing in linguistics that demands that a term must be used that way outside of the scope of whatever essay is being read. This also goes for those demanding that the word atheism only be used in the sense of a lack of belief, something we'll get to later on. However, let's keep on the subject of Nagel's essay and definition of atheism for just a little bit longer. In part 1 of his essay, Nagel lays out a couple of ways in which the term atheism has been used. One is the way in which it has been used historically as an abusive label for those who do not happen to subscribe to some regnant orthodoxy. He does not declare that those uses are incorrect uses of the term atheism, nor does he argue that they did not know what the word actually means. Instead, Nagel just states that he is not using it in that sense. There are also a couple of points to be made from part 6 of Nagel's essay. Nagel mentions that there has never been what one might call a school of atheism, in the way that there has been a Platonic school or even a Kantian school. Here we can see that Nagel states that no one unifying doctrine of atheism must be ascribed to, nor is there a particular way of thinking about atheism that makes all other ways of thinking about atheism wrong. Nagel argues that atheism is not simply a negative standpoint, but not in the sense that anyone that uses it in the negative standpoint is wrong, something that even Flew agreed with while arguing that atheism would be best viewed as a negative viewpoint in his paper The Presumption of Atheism. Neither Nagel or Flew argue that atheism is and only is one particular thing. In the same part from Nagel's essay, he uses the term village atheist to describe those who twit and ridicule those who accept some form of theism. At no point does he state that village atheists are not real atheists, or that they must adopt philosophical atheism in order to be considered atheists. Nagel distinguishes different kinds of atheism from each other, certainly, but at no point does he declare that the others are not actually atheism, just that they are a different form of atheism.
Several things immediately follow from these definitions. In the first place, atheism is not necessarily an irreligious concept, for theism is just one among many views concerning the nature and origin of the world. I had an atheist come on my channel and actually swear at me, recently because I called atheism a worldview. Well, if you have a view of the world with God and someone else has a view of the world without God, there are consequences of those ideas that there is a God or there is no God. There are implications for morals, for law, for behavior. But apparently I'm wrong, although this highly qualified scientist and professional academic, he clearly doesn't know what he's talking about because he's saying the same thing I said.
So, the quote shown by Lloyd here does indeed come directly from Nagel's essay. I'm pretty sure that no reasonable atheist would dispute the idea that atheism is not necessarily an irreligious concept, though. In the essay, Nagel brings up the idea of the Buddhist that denies the existence of God, which is also something that I have seen many atheists themselves bringing up, referring to such religions as atheistic religions. The quote from Nagel isn't really the interesting part here, though. It is Lloyd's declaration of atheism as a worldview and declaration that Nagel agrees with him. First, I just want to say that if you're an atheist that's swearing and getting angry at people for calling atheism a worldview, then you might be being a little overzealous in your atheism. You probably don't see it as a mere lack of belief, but something more personal. But to get to Lloyd's claim that atheism is a worldview, in her 2011 paper, Worldviews, Alison J. Gray describes a worldview as a collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations about the world around us, which inform our every thought and action. The paper also states that worldview is expressed in ethics, religion, philosophy, scientific beliefs, and so on. This gives us some indication of why it is wrong to call atheism a worldview. Atheism itself is not a collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations of the world around us which inform our every thought and action. Lloyd argues that there are consequences of the idea that there is a God, or not believing there is a God, or believing there is not a God, which I agree with. Believing there is a God will certainly inform other ideas, including the ideas that Lloyd mentions like morality, law, behavior, and so forth. However, atheism is not necessarily the view that informs the other views. It could be the case that it is the other views that form an agent's atheism. For example, if someone is convinced by naturalism or Buddhism, then that will inform their idea that there is no God. A person's skepticism could be what forms their non-belief in God, rather than their non-belief in God forming their skepticism. Atheism may inform other views, certainly, but it need not necessarily be the cause of those views. What you can see on screen now is a chart from Gray's paper titled Worldview Map. As can be seen, atheism is a few layers deep in the worldview categorizations, and in fact comes under naturalism, with naturalism being the grounding of the view. Consider too what Nagel said in his essay, that atheism is not necessarily an irreligious view. It can in fact be part of a religious view. If atheism was the worldview in and of itself, and a collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations about the world around us, it would not be a part of Buddhism. It could not be a part of Buddhism because it would not lead to Buddhism. It would lead to a worldview entirely of its own. Instead, what we see is that atheism is a part of a worldview rather than an independent worldview itself. In the case of Buddhism, it is the Buddhism that informs the atheism rather than the atheism informing the Buddhism. Lloyd makes a snarky comment, unsurprisingly, about how he is accused of being wrong about atheism being a worldview, even though this highly qualified scientist and professional academic is saying the same thing as him. As we can see though, Nagel is not saying the same thing as him. Nagel is not saying that atheism is a worldview. Nagel is saying that atheism need not necessarily be irreligious and can be part of a religious worldview. In other words, Nagel agrees with Gray in that atheism is a part of a worldview, not a worldview itself.
The denial of theism is logically compatible with a religious outlook upon life, and is in fact a characteristic of some of the great historical religions. Early Buddhism is a religion which does not subscribe to any doctrine about a god. Buddha was an atheist. Buddhism is considered a religion. Denial of theism is a religious outlook upon life. That's a worldview. There are pantheistic religions and philosophies which, because they deny that God is being separate from and independent of the world, are not theistic in the sense above. So you have non-theistic religions like atheism.
This section that Lloyd quotes gives further support for what was just argued. The fact that atheism is logically compatible with religious outlooks means that it is not a worldview in and of itself. In the case of Buddhism, we can see what Gray describes. Buddhism is a collection of attitudes, values, stories, and expectations about the world around us, with atheism being a part of that collection of attitudes. Buddhism is not a part of the collection of attitudes in atheism, otherwise atheists would be Buddhists. There would be no atheists that were naturalists because naturalism would not be a part of that collection of attitudes to be found in atheism. Or there would be no atheists that were Buddhists because naturalism would be the part of the collection of attitudes to be found in atheism. Lloyd makes the argument that atheism is a worldview using the example of Buddhism in this section. His argument goes something like, Premise 1, Buddhism is considered a religion. Premise 2, denial of theism is a religious outlook upon life. Conclusion, therefore denial of theism is a worldview. Just laying it out in this form shows that the inferences do not follow and most certainly do not lead to the conclusion. The first premise does not lead to the second premise in any sense, and the conclusion certainly does not follow from the second premise. There is nothing in that argument that suggests that atheism is a worldview, apart from Lloyd's faulty conclusion. As shown for both Nagel and Gray, atheism can be part of a worldview, but it is not the worldview itself. Buddhism is the worldview, and Buddhism just so happens to contain the denial of theism, in much the same way that naturalism is the worldview, and the denial of theism is contained in that worldview. Lloyd also goes on to make the claim that atheism is a non-theistic religion, this time using pantheism to ground that opinion. And this time the argument goes something like, Premise 1, pantheistic religions deny that God is a being separate and independent from the world. Premise 2, so they are not theistic in the sense that Nagel describes them. Conclusion, therefore you have non-theistic religions like atheism. Again, when laying the argument out like this, we can see that the inferences do not follow and most certainly once again do not lead to the conclusion. The fact that non-theistic religions exist does not lead to the conclusion that atheism itself is a religion. At best, the conclusion would be that we have non-theistic religions which contain atheism, something that Nagel already agrees with in his essay, and something that even a lack-of-belief style atheist already agrees with.
This is very interesting here. Atheism is not to be identified with sheer unbelief, this lack of belief, or with disbelief in some particular creed of religious group, because atheism was founded specifically as an anti-Christian doctrine, specifically directed at the Christian church. Thus, a child who has not received religious instruction and has never heard about God is not an atheist, for he is not denying any theistic claims. This tells us that atheists specifically deny theistic claims, which means they are making a case, they have an argument, they've reached a conclusion, they're taking a position, they've done some analyses, and they've now formed an idea that says, okay, no, I reject God because of X, Y, and Z. This goes against the common claim.
Here, Lloyd discusses Nagel arguing that atheism should not be identified with mere unbelief, or with disbelief in some particular religion, meaning that children should not be identified as atheists, as they have never had religious instruction or heard about God. Children are not denying any theistic claims, so therefore they're not atheists. Both of these points are actually something I agree with, because they are entailed by how I use the term, just as both of these points are entailed by how Nagel uses the term, which means they are entailed within the scope of the essay. However, just because they are entailed by the way I or Nagel uses the term, or other philosophers use the term, the way that Nagel and philosophers use the term does not entail that all people must use the term that way. Something to note here is that Lloyd is more than happy to ditch the way Nagel is using the term, and the arguments that Nagel makes, as soon as he needs to make a point about his own beliefs about atheism. While Lloyd is happy to tell atheists that they must use the term in the way that Nagel is using the term, Lloyd is more than happy to use the term as he sees fit. And by this I mean that Lloyd claims here that atheism was specifically founded as an anti-Christian doctrine, and specifically directed at the Christian church. Yet this goes against several things that Nagel argues in his essay. In fact, it goes against something that Nagel mentions in the very paragraph that Lloyd is discussing. Nagel states here that atheism is not to be identified with disbelief in some particular religion, meaning that it is not to be identified specifically with disbelief in Christianity. So what Lloyd is describing cannot be atheism in the sense that Nagel is using the term. Nagel is arguing that it is only atheism if it is against all forms of theistic thinking. So while Lloyd is more than happy to argue that lack of belief atheists are using the term incorrectly because they are using the term in a different manner to Nagel, and that it is the denial of theism because Nagel declares it so, he is more than happy to label something atheism that does not fit the bill of Nagel's definition when it suits him. The other thing to note here that Lloyd says that goes against Nagel's argument is something mentioned previously in the video. Nagel clearly states that there is no school of atheism in the sense that there is a Platonic school or a Kantian school. There is no central doctrine, no unifying school of thought, and no founding of atheism. Atheism is a collection of thinkers who argue against the existence of God, or argue against believing in the existence of God, not a particular school of thought. They may certainly be influenced by other thinkers, both contemporary and historically, but there is no school of thought that must be followed or that atheists must follow. In other words, atheism was not founded specifically against Christian thought because there is no sense in which atheism was founded as a school in the manner that Lloyd is speaking of. Lloyd also says that atheists are making a case and have reached a conclusion that theistic claims are false. They are, as he states, taking a position on the existence of God. And this is something that I can agree with. Even in the sense of lack of belief atheism, the lack of belief atheist is taking the position that there is not enough evidence to warrant belief in God, and sometimes taking the position of local atheism. The philosophical atheist, or strong atheist, is taking the position that God does not exist. While there are those lack of belief atheists that may deny that they are taking a position, they would be just as wrong as Lloyd is here when he argues that atheism is a religion. However, while all atheists may be taking a position, not all atheists are taking the same position. And while philosophical atheism might exclude some lack of belief atheists from being atheists, that is only within the scope of that usage. As is already clear, and as Nagel himself states, that is not the only flavor of atheism that exists.
Let's have a look at a different book published in the same period, an anthology of atheism and rationalism. They speak here of Baron de Holbach, who wrote the first openly atheistic book, The System of Nature, in 1770. He defined atheism in this way. He wrote in his book, Good Sense, 1772, all children are atheists. They have no idea of God. Children who have not been exposed to theism being by definition atheists. This follows from our definition of an atheist as someone without a belief in God.
Here we can see a different definition of atheism, one that closely resembles the lack of belief style atheism. De Holbach argues that babies are indeed atheists as they do not hold a belief in God, which follows from how atheism is being defined here as someone without belief in God. In other words, in the scope of this work and the scope of this definition, babies fall into the category of atheist. Just as in the scope of Nagel's essay and Nagel's definition, babies do not fall into the category of atheist. Both are correct. Both conclusions are entailed by how each is using the word. There is nothing in either work that states that either definition is the only correct definition, or that either definition is the only one that atheists must adhere to. Neither argument states that others are using the term wrong, or that they do not know what atheism actually is. Nagel even uses the term village atheist in his essay to describe someone like de Holbach, meaning that Nagel appears to be more than happy to call them an atheist, even if there is some derision going on. It is just that those that de Holbach considers atheist may not be considered atheist in the sense that Nagel is using the term. Simply looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry Atheism and Agnosticism shows us that even philosophers agree that the term is polysemous. Flew argues for negative atheism, Lorkowski argues for positive atheism, Draper classifies atheists in a local and global sense, Oppie can be found arguing both that atheism is the belief that God does not exist and that we should just use the term in the sense that the agent is using it, and Law can be found arguing much the same as Oppie. This goes back to the idea that there is no singular and unifying school of atheism. We can argue for what we think is the best use of the term, but there is no argument that can be made for atheism only being a particular thing. That simply is not the way that words work when it comes to something like atheism. With there being no school of atheism and no foundation for atheism as there is for Platonism or Kantianism or utilitarianism, etc., there is only the way a person uses the term or those people use the term. This applies to those that argue that lack of belief in gods is the only definition of atheism also.
This means my toaster, my wallet, my watch, the cat next door, the pigeons, the budgies in your neighbor's yard, the alligators in the swamp are all atheists. So atheism has now become the world's fastest growing religion.
Remember what I said earlier about that snark? Well, here it is again, and once again it is misplaced. Lloyd argues that if we take the Holbach's definition as the de facto definition of atheist, then his toaster, his wallet, his watch, the cat next door, and lots of other inanimate objects are atheist. To some extent, Aaron Ra and lots of his followers take the blame for this. For a long time, Aaron Ra and lots of his followers have argued that rocks are atheist and that this follows from the definition of atheism. There is a whole bunch of sophistry that is followed in order to protect this choice of words, but ultimately what they mean is that rocks, Lloyd's toaster and wallet, the cat next door, and all other inanimate objects are atheistic. I cover this argument in some detail in my video, The Ridiculousness of Atheistic Rocks, if you want to see it broken down. However, to get back to Lloyd's argument, we see here that in his eagerness to be snarky, he's missed something. In his eagerness to be snarky, Lloyd has missed the word someone from the Holbach's definition, meaning that Lloyd's wallet, toaster, and watch cannot be atheists in the sense that the Holbach is using the term. Well, not unless Lloyd is granting his wallet, toaster, and watch personhood. And if he is, I hope he's treating them well and giving them all the respect due to something that has personhood. So no, just as Aaron Ra is wrong to declare that rocks are atheist, so too is Lloyd wrong to declare that his toaster, watch, wallet, and his cat next door, and all other inanimate objects are atheist, making his atheism is the fastest growing religion comment even more misinformed snark than his claim that atheism is a religion because it's part of Buddhism. Just as with the logic he used to argue that conclusion, this one too is pretty terrible.
Again, how does that gel with this contradictory definition by Nagel? A child who has not received religious instruction and has never heard about God is not an atheist or is not denying any theistic claims.
Lloyd asks here how the two definitions gel with each other, as they are contradictory. Well, that one is pretty simple. They both exist in different contexts and are used by different people. Neither one is the absolute one true definition, and neither one means that the other one is incorrect. What it means is that if one person is using it one way, then that's how we understand that person to be using it. If another is using it the other way, then that's how we understand that person to be using it. With there being no official school of atheism, both definitions are using the term correctly and in a valid manner because that's how they are defining it. Words get their meaning from usage, and that's how they are using the word and what they mean by the word. Just as lack of belief atheists are wrong to argue that the word must be used in the sense of lack of belief, so too are those using it in the philosophical sense wrong to argue that the word must be used in that sense. With there being no founding of a school of atheism with a unifying definition and unifying doctrine, this is just something that all atheists must accept. Words can only be used incorrectly in a contextual sense, and the context is laid out when it is explained how the essay or the agent is using the word. Lloyd should be happy about this though, for it's because of this that he no longer has to accept the title of atheist, as that is one of the ways that the word was used historically, as Nagel mentions in his essay. If there was a school of atheism that was founded by the Greeks when they used it to declare Christians of atheists, then Lloyd would forever be stuck with the label of atheist.
He goes on to say that indifference is not atheism. He says, similarly, in the case of an adult who, if he has withdrawn from the faith of his fathers without reflection or because of frank indifference to any theological issue, is also not an atheist. For such an adult is not challenging theism and is not professing any views on the subject. So the Church of Atheism has these set of opposing views. They're contradictory. So maybe the atheist congregation can explain to us who's right, but we know which one they'll pick because they want to inflate their numbers.
So let's wrap this up both by covering Lloyd's final comments and then giving some of my own. Lloyd once again here gives us Nagel's definition of atheism, stating that those that are indifferent to theistic claims or simply withdrawn from the faith of their fathers is not an atheist. For them to be considered atheist, they must be professing views that are challenging theism, which would be true under the definition of atheism that Nagel uses. It would not be true under the definition of atheism that de Holbach uses, though. But as already stated, neither one is the de facto definition of atheism. Thanks to there being no actual school of atheism that has ever been founded, there is also no de facto definition of atheism that has ever been founded. Lloyd once again ends with some misplaced snark with a Church of Atheism comment, and that it has these different definitions of atheism, missing the point that it's because there is no Church of Atheism that there exists these different definitions of atheism. While there may be atheists that have set up churches in recent years, these are not churches that preach doctrine that must be followed in the same sense that Christian churches do. And yes, they have congregations where people get together to discuss whatever it is they discuss. There is no larger Church of Atheism congregations in the sense that Christians have them, though, or in the sense that Muslims have mosques. Of course, we could say the same thing about Christianity here. There appear to be lots of different theological views when it comes to Christianity. There is old earth Christians and young earth Christians. There are Christians that accept evolution and Christians that deny evolution. There are Christians that argue against race mixing and Christians that argue against those Christians. There are Christians that are okay with gay marriage and Christians that think homosexuals should be executed. There appears to be lots of contradictory views that exist in Christianity writ large. Churches and congregations actually exist in Christianity, and there is even ruling bodies that exist within Christianity. Yet, we still see these contradictory views existing within Christianity. We see different sects, different denominations. We see those that argue that salvation comes through faith and works, and some that argue that it comes through faith alone, and some that argue it is predestined and only the select are saved. So, when are Christians going to get together to argue which one is the one true version of Christianity? Why, after thousands of years, have Christians still not sorted out which one is the one true Christianity? The reason why is that, just like the definition of atheism, it is one of preference and interpretation. However, unlike atheism, there is a book that all professing Christians claim to be following. If Christians can't get it together even when they have a book laying it all out for them, why should atheists be expected to act as a unitary body when they don't even have a school of atheism that was founded? Anyway, that's about it for this video. Thanks for tuning in. I hope to see you again soon and hope that life treats you well, whoever you are. Take care. Bye.